Whitechapel, a neighborhood of shadows and secrets, cobblestones and crime. A Victorian slum where police rub shoulders with prostitutes.
Come on then, I know a spot. Why so nervous?
It's not your first time, is it?
Don't worry about that copper. He won't be back for ages.
But tonight, a figure from hell emerges, and a legend is born.
Jack the Ripper did just that. He ripped. He stabbed and he ripped.
Jack the Ripper, the man that the police couldn't catch. He was gliding in, committing murder, gliding out again. He was beating Scotland Yard on their doorstep.
I don't think that the story can ever be completely closed.
Jack the Ripper embodies the fear that we all have of the shadows. That thing that's there that we don't know what it is, we can offer no protection against. That these poor women were being murdered, but it was the manner in which they were being murdered. The bodies were horrifically mutilated, eviscerated, slashed to ribbons in some cases. They were just being butchered. And that is a terrifying, terrifying atmosphere to live in, as indeed it would be today.
The gruesome pull of Jack the Ripper brings several experts to a pub on the outskirts of London.
We were talking about Tabram.
Ancient clues and well-worn details are examined again.
Popular image of Spring-Heel Jack is
The cutting only takes place on the ground. First cut through the left carotid artery, the second blow cut down to the vertebrae, then the mutilation takes place. So you do not need a stabbing weapon.
Effectively, ripperologists are historians. Ripperologists produce a lot of very good, solid, sound information, and it's on a range of subjects that aren't just involved in Jack the Ripper. Now, the consensus of opinion was that the knife that did the damage on these murders was double-edged. Ouch, shouldn't do that. And approximately 6 to 8 inches long. And the other thing to remember about knives when you're stabbing people is you really do want a quillion. This is this bit here.
It's protecting your own hand, presumably.
That's right.
When again, at that area, you've got a lot of slaughterhouses in the area.
Yes.
Knives would be considered tools of trade.
By 1888, the Industrial Revolution has drawn tens of thousands to London, the poor and the desperate, seeking a better life. But the reality is grinding poverty. Many are trapped in a slum where 90,000 people scrape by.
Whitechapel had been an immigrant area since the 17th century. In this area, it was 800 people to an acre. Outside this area, it was 50 to an acre, which gives you some idea of the overcrowding.
And of course, at about this time, you had the pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe, where the Russians were cracking down on Jews and driving them from their land. This was the entrance to Britain. This is where everybody came. And of course, if you were poor, you didn't leave. This is where you stayed. Once you'd got to the East End of London, there wasn't anywhere else lower that you could go to. It was really the Skid Row.
The poorest of the poor were Whitechapel's women. All they have left to sell are their bodies.
Well, the 5 victims are what we would regard today as casual prostitutes. They weren't professional prostitutes. They were forced to sell themselves just to get enough money to survive.
They were alcoholic, they were poor, they carried their home with them. By that I mean their clothes. They didn't wear just one skirt, they wore perhaps 2 or 3. The few possessions they had, they carried in a bag underneath one of the skirts. We're looking at a comb, some tea, some sugar, a piece of broken mirror.
On August 31st, the autumn of horror begins. Mary Ann Nichols, whose friends call her Polly, will soon be known as victim number 1.
By her own admission, she'd made her lodging money 3 times that day and drunk the lot. She was wearing a black straw bonnet which was trimmed with black velvet. She deemed this to be some kind of aid to earning money.
Abandoned by her husband and estranged from her 5 children, Polly has survived on the streets for almost a decade.
Being in her mid-40s by this time and being a drunk prostitute in Whitechapel, she was not what you call the greatest catch. From approximately 2:30 until her body was found at 3:40 a.m. We have no idea what she was doing. There was no sightings.
Mary Ann Nichols was found lying in Bucks Row, Whitechapel, which she was lying in the street at 20 to 4 in the morning, and a guy going to work came across her body lying on the footpath.
He was under the immediate impression that she was drunk, but when he looked closely at her, he could see that she had her throat cut.
It was only when she was taken to the mortuary and the corpse was stripped that it was realised that she'd been basically eviscerated. That murder really caught the public attention and shocked people.
But the horror has just started. A savage killer stalks the streets. Soon, the cobblestones of Whitechapel will be stained with more blood. The blood of his first victim runs in the streets of Whitechapel. The legend of Jack the Ripper has begun, one that echoes 100 years later.
Now, if the knife was carried up the sleeve in a sheath, I can't put it all the way up, and you did that, when the person's on the ground, all you have to do is withdraw the knife and bring it across. The blood goes that way, it doesn't go onto you, and you've done the slash. When they're down, then you can do the second slash.
There is a small element of ghoulishness to it, but you've always got to keep hold of the fact that what we're doing is talking about real people, women who suffered needlessly, who didn't deserve what happened to them.
The very first thing that struck me was that she looks like one of us, meaning one of my family, because the resemblance, even though the very first time I saw it, it was very shocking. And I think because I knew it was a death photo, and I thought I could have been looking at a picture of my own mother.
For Maureen Nichols, the legend is much more personal. She recently discovered she is a descendant of the Ripper's first victim. She's come here from Canada to learn more about the tragic life of her ancestor.
My great-great-grandmother was murdered in London, and that, of course, is a famous case, Mary Ann Nichols. I know that Mary Ann Nichols has been dead for many, many years, but I still feel she deserves to have someone in her family treat her like her life and her death were important.
Maureen, hello.
Nice to
Nice
meet
to finally meet you. Yeah, it sounds odd, but I can actually see the family resemblance.
Thank you.
Welcome to a lovely Whitechapel. Busy Whitechapel Road. Every day you come here, it's a thriving market. It's always busy. You'll never come through here and see this quiet nearly 100 years later.
Yes.
But it's exactly the same spot. Because the building we're at now the Shiraz Balti Cuisine, this was the Frying Pan pub, and this is where Polly was drinking. This was the last building she was actually seen in. Very often to stay in a lodging house, you had to have generally 4p a night for your bed. And of course, prostitution nowadays is regarded as some kind of moral decay, but it was an act of pure necessity. The majority of poor women around here would find themselves a prostitute even briefly for some period in their lives, because there was no other means of survival. It was something that would have disgusted them to have to do, but that would get them the money they needed for their bed for the night.
It would be very sad to have to be walking around and in the cold and not knowing where you're going to sleep.
It is a desperate, dangerous way to make money. A decision thousands are forced to make in Whitechapel every day.
Now, if they managed to get together some money, then they could go to one of the refuges that existed in the East End. And every night, between 7,000 and 8,000 homeless men, women and children queued outside these to get a bed. The women would prostitute themselves. They would sell themselves for 3 pennies, 2 pennies, or a loaf of stale bread. That tells you the value that was on these women's bodies. It was a brutal, brutal existence. And it was these women that the man we call Jack the Ripper chose as his victims.
Studies now, it's not this rubbish about who is it. But this is the spot where Polly was murdered, I'm afraid. On the edge of what was a brown stable yard. The entrance was here. Polly's body was actually was found, you know, right next to the gate, and projecting a little way into the street itself. The general consensus is that Polly was quickly throttled, so there wasn't a chance to cry out. People are always going on about this idea of because there was, you know, so much violence committed on the bodies after they died, that he was some kind of sadist, but perverted and you know, mentally unstable, certainly. But he didn't torture anyone that he killed. They were throttled into unconsciousness fairly quickly, and all the brutality with the knives was done during unconsciousness or indeed after death.
It's very, very sad to think that anybody would end up dying in such a terrible way. And of course, she died many, many years before I was born, but it's still, she's one of my people, and to think that somebody that would be in my family would have that happen is, it's just unspeakable. I don't even know how to put it into words.
September 8th, 1888. It's been just 1 week since the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, when the Ripper strikes again.
Annie Chapman, number 2. She had children. One of them was terribly handicapped and crippled. Her husband was a coachman. He eventually died of cirrhosis of the liver.
Her husband's death pushes Annie Chapman into the streets of Whitechapel. Another desperate woman working in the shadows.
Now, the prostitutes would know quiet locations where they could go with a customer. Annie Chapman knew the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, which was regularly used by prostitutes. And so they go to a dark corner, and unwittingly the prostitute assists in her own death.
Possibly because the killer had longer and was more hidden, the mutilations to this poor woman were even more horrific. She had been completely disemboweled and her intestines thrown over her shoulder. Also, there were parts of her body that were found to be missing.
And this brutality and mutilation was something that's certainly unknown in this country. I mean, you'd had the odd gruesome murder, but with victims left on the street in full display with all these horrific injuries was something really quite new.
The atmosphere during that period was absolutely incredible. It's like today when you're walking along the street not knowing whether there's a bomb going to go off any minute. And this was the late Victorian version of a car bomb, if you like, exploding right in the middle of the masses. Terrifying.
The uncertainty and horror feed another animal, Britain's tabloid press. Newspapers latched onto the murders of Chapman and Nichols, the stories fanning the fear.
Before then, newspapers were, broadly speaking, just solid blocks of very, very small type. All of a sudden, you could have dozens of exciting photographs. And of course, if you could get chopped up bodies and female nudity all on the front page, you had a winner. all the population could now devour the news. And of course, they really went for it.
One of the newspapers started reporting the murders as the romance of the East End. I mean, these are very common and brutal murders. Romance is an astonishing word to use in such a context.
The height of the Ripper scare, they were printing 2 or 3 editions a day, and these were selling out as soon as they hit the sidewalk. People were fighting for newspapers. Little boys ran through the streets with newspapers over their arm, shouting the famous cry, "Horrible murder! Horrible murder!"
The cry will continue to echo through the Whitechapel streets. Soon, more bodies will raise more questions and launch a frantic hunt for a killer. August 1888. A brutal killer rules the London night. 2 savage murders in as many weeks. But who is Jack the Ripper? And why can't the police catch him?
One of the detectives involved in the investigation was asked by a reporter, "Did you have any suspects?" And he threw up his hands in horror and said, "Suspects? We had far too many suspects."
You have something like over 1,000 letters a week going into Scotland Yard, pointing the finger at X, Y, or Z. I mean, some of the examples are absolutely ludicrous. They reckon Jack the Ripper was an orangutan leaping over the roofs of Whitechapel.
If somebody looked suspicious, then you'd get a gang of people on the street pursuing some innocent person who'd been accused of being the Ripper.
Overwhelmed with suspects, the police struggle to cope. Then, one sinister character emerges.
One of the first suspects to come to light was a man called Leatherapron, this ghoul-like character that was out there. This man was supposed to be terrorizing the local prostitutes and extorting money from them.
The police tell us in the reports that a local man, John Pizer, was known as Leatherapron because he wore a leather apron in his trade. The main reason he came under suspicion was that he had been seen, allegedly, with Chapman before she was murdered.
He was also supposed to be Jewish, and that had a big anti-Semitic kickback in the East End at the time.
And so you get pieces written about no Englishman would have committed such a murder, it has to be a foreigner. By foreigner, Jew.
Pizer is quickly cleared and dismissed. The case grows more confusing. Letters are sent to police and newspapers.
The most famous letter of all is the letter which is sent to the Central News Agency beginning "Dear Boss" and signed Jack the Ripper.
With the name Jack the Ripper, this became the first really international serial killer, if you like. The name was broadcast across to America, Canada, France, Germany, all over the world, in fact.
But the name Jack the Ripper has become synonymous with not only a serial killer, but a serial killer who hacks and mutilates his victims.
Yeah. I mean, it just grabs. I mean, it's a brand name. And yet the ridiculous thing is, the number of murders committed by Jack the Ripper is quite small.
Very small.
You compare it with the Yorkshire Ripper, you compare him with Ted Bundy and all sorts of other killers, and Jack fades into complete...
He was after their obliteration. He had an overwhelming desire to destroy, not to kill, but to destroy. That's something entirely different.
That desire fuels the Ripper's rage. He isn't satisfied with Stride's death. It was too quick, too easy. Just an hour later, he meets 46-year-old Catherine Eddowes.
Catherine Eddowes had been arrested for drunkenness by the city police on the night she was murdered, or 8 o'clock in the evening. She was taken to Bishopsgate Street police station and placed in the cells, and she was kept until the sergeant felt that she was sober. Then she was released at 1 a.m. and 45 minutes later her dead body was found in Mitre Square.
This time, the Ripper's madness is on full display. Eddowes is disemboweled. Her face is mutilated. And one of her kidneys is gone.
This is referred to as the double event, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. And that really, in many ways, was the apotheosis of horror.
The shocking double murder unleashes more taunting letters. One of them literally sent from hell.
In my opinion, the only letter that might be authentic, i.e. written by the murderer, is one which accompanied a piece of kidney which was said to have been cut from the body of Catherine Eddowes. He says, "I send you a piece of the woman's kidney. I preserved it. The other piece I fried and ate. It was lovely." And interestingly enough, it was one of the few Jack the Ripper letters that wasn't actually signed Jack the Ripper, and it was just signed "Catch me when you can."
It doesn't seem like a hoax. When the kidney is examined, police discover it comes from a woman suffering from Bright's disease, something that plagued Eddowes.
The reason I think that is possibly a genuine letter from the killer is if you read it, it contains something which the other letters do not, and that is passion. And the one thing about murderers, when they write, they do have a passion for what they're doing.
Terror sweeps the city. A stunned public reacts. Witnesses emerge, but their descriptions are vague and contradictory.
The tallest height we have for Jack is about 5'7". He's male, he's white, in the 28-29 age group. One description has him wearing a round peak cap like a sailor, salt and pepper jacket. Another description, he's wearing an ankle-length overcoat. Another description, he is shabbily dressed. He has anatomical knowledge and some surgical knowledge. How that knowledge was acquired, we don't know. He may have acquired it as a surgeon, as a doctor, medical student, mortuary attendant, or much more likely a butcher or a slaughterman. He works with speed, and that's about the best you can say.
I think most modern commentators seem to think that there was no surgical skill required.
So there must have been some skill to have actually, in the near dark, removed kidney.
Don't you think it could have been done by the sort of slash and grab method?
Well, they said that the removal of the kidney was done quite carefully.
Yeah.
From Catherine Eddowes. And I've had doctors in front of me, or surgeons in front of me, who've laughed when I've said, in that period of time, as if to say, you have got to be kidding.
Whatever his skill or motivation, the Ripper seems unstoppable. Public outcry is so great, the Queen herself will soon be involved. October 1888. Jack the Ripper has murdered 4 times. London's autumn of terror continues. The poor who live in Whitechapel beg for help.
In the East End, of course, the women were terrified. And there was a petition signed by over 40,000 women sent to Queen Victoria asking for her help in catching the murderer. And the Queen did get involved. Over half the police force, something like 600 men, was put into plain clothes to catch Jack the Ripper. This is in the 1 square mile only.
You had cases of policemen being dressed up in female attire and dragged up and going around dressed as prostitutes to catch Jack the Ripper in the act.
It's worth bearing in mind how the police were handicapped. There was no DNA. It was another 17 years before fingerprinting became an official technique. The difference could not be told between animal and human blood. So the murderer could be standing at the scene, covered with blood, his fingerprints are all over the murder scene, and no way could you put the two together.
People subsequently have aimed a lot of criticism at the police. What they did was to talk to people. They spoke to people, they put up notices, they flooded the area. In the course of a week, they distributed over 80,000 leaflets to all the people in that area, asking them, did you see anything? Did you hear anything? Do you know anything?
But their best efforts are doomed from the beginning. Methods born in the 1800s cannot deal with a modern-day horror.
Policemen, certainly in the city, were timed over their beats so that an inspector could look at his watch. It says now 7:10, PCX should be at such and such a location. If he wasn't there, then that could be a disciplinary offence, punishable by a fine. A lot of the policemen, because they couldn't risk the fine, they said they often ignored crime simply to keep the timing with the inspector or sergeant.
Right from the word go, they really were hampered by the fact that they were fighting something they had no experience of and very little chance of catching.
The police do make a vital discovery. A bloody piece of cloth from one of the victims. It's from the dress of Catherine Eddowes. And it is found underneath a disturbing message. The threat of a foreign killer rises again.
You had this strange message written on the wall in Goulston Street after the Eddowes murder that concerned Jews, and obviously that caused a bit of discussion as to whether a Jew might be involved.
During the time of the Jack the Ripper murders, there was always the fear that riots, anti-Semitic riots, would take place.
In fact, it so concerned Sir Charles Warren, the commissioner. He came out and looked at it, and it was sponged off the wall before it could be photographed.
With few clues, police try to trace the Ripper's path. Is there a pattern to where he kills? And can they predict where he might strike again?
We know, beyond all reasonable doubt, the killer was in Mitre Square. That's where he murdered Catherine Eddowes. We know, beyond all reasonable doubt, he was also in Wentworth Street. That's where he threw down the rag. Joined the dots. 1 dot, 2 dot. Where's the third dot? Where's he going?
But the shadows and alleys of Whitechapel are the Ripper's best defense.
They say, surely somebody must have seen him in a
probably
ground
did.
which is only 15 minutes across. You have a vigilance committee, you have extra police, you have the prostitutes and public aware of what is actually going on in the area, and yet nobody sees him. And I think they don't see him because he is so ordinary that they can't see the monster.
Unknown. Free to kill again. Jack the Ripper isn't finished with the women of Whitechapel. November 1888. 5 weeks pass. The Ripper has gone silent. An uneasy calm settles over Whitechapel. Jack the Ripper's autumn of terror seems at an end. It doesn't last.
Why are you laughing? What do you think?
Mary Jane Kelly is just 25.
What do you think about me?
Born in Wales, she's a Whitechapel prostitute.
Let's go the rest of the way.
Getting to it?
But unlike others who work in the alleys, Kelly has her own flat.
Close the door and let nobody hear that.
For 3 years, she's made a living here. After tonight, she'll never leave again.
All right, have a sweet.
finally it got to the 9th of November when the last of the canonical victims, that was Mary Jane Kelly, who was butchered.
The body totally opened up, all the organs taken out, the heart apparently missing, the face destroyed beyond recognition. The killer was in the room. She was in bed. She was naked apart from a chemise that she was wearing. She was killed by the carotid artery being severed, the throat being cut. There was arterial spray on the wall. And then the mutilation was commenced. We don't know how long it took. It could probably have been completed in under 30 minutes. So we don't even know how long the killer was in the room with her.
It took the surgeons several hours to reconstruct the body. And after the body was moved, it was later reported that the body and the other parts were taken out of the room in 8 buckets.
Only in the case of Kelly do we have actual crime scene photographs. So the crime scene photos of the Kelly murder are amongst the earliest known to exist.
The photos capture a scene of unspeakable horror. But like all the Ripper victims, the myth of the killer obscures the lives of those who died.
Most people seem to think is that they're just murder victims. I want people to see that they have been married women, they've had children, they've lived ordinary lives and became victims of a murderer. I've focused on the victims and what happened to them and how they got to be in Whitechapel by 1888. I've been able to contact descendants of the Ripper victims. I met Maureen, the Nichols descendant.
So nice to meet you.
And then to the Eddowes descendants as well. The initial reaction is usually one of surprise and perhaps a bit of upset, but eventually they come around to thinking that they want to know about their ancestor.
Yeah, it was quite a shock to find out that my great-grandmother was killed by Jack the Ripper.
I think it's important to keep the memory of the victims alive because it was so grotesque what happened to them. That needs to be kept alive because it is history, it is our history, it's also like obviously London's history.
The Jack the Ripper story is one of the few little parts of history which is about working class people and about us, if you like. Most of us, if you start digging into your own family histories, I know I've got a number of connections to the East End, and you find a lot of people do, and then it becomes real to them because they've got a direct family connection to the case. With other parts of history, you tend to be rich, famous, the powerful, but here you focus on real working class people, and I think that is something which everyone feels that they can get involved, and it's simple connections like that that makes it something real, much more alive.
For Maureen Nichols, focusing on the victims means she's learning more about her long-lost relative and who she was before her tragic death.
I don't think there's any stigma whatsoever to what Mary Ann did to support herself, how she got her money. If she was down and out and had nothing, she would have to survive whatever way she could. I'm sure all the women that were the victims had other aspects to their life besides whatever people might think is sort of sordid. No, it's no stigma whatsoever. I don't feel ashamed for that. I feel very badly for her that that's what she had to resort to.
Circumstance brought Polly Nichols and Maureen into the Ripper's savage world. The fact that he was never caught keeps his legend alive. He's a figure of legend and myth, a long-dead killer who lives on.
Everyone's preconception of Jack the Ripper is the quintessential movie image. The London fog, the tall silhouette in the top hat and the cape and the cane. It belongs to fiction.
And here with the Penny Illustrated, we've got this classic image of Jack the Ripper with a top hat outside Mary Kelly's room. And obviously, you get an image like this. I mean, the Ripper wearing a top hat, a long greatcoat and carrying a Gladstone bag. This is a classic image of the Ripper, although it would look nothing like the actual killer, in my opinion.
If we ever did actually pin down Jack the Ripper, what sort of person would we find there? I think it's fairly obvious, looking at the murders, that he had an overwhelming and insuppressible anger and rage. These are rage killings, almost like a kettle that was building up to boiling, and then every so often he would just explode. And I wouldn't mind betting that after he had killed, he might not even have realized what he had done. All the exaltation of the kill would have completely wasted him.
In November of 1888, Jack the Ripper stops as suddenly as he began. As autumn ends, Whitechapel's horror starts to fade. But the questions never do. What happened to Jack the Ripper? And who was he?
It's got to such a ridiculous length with the Ripper story, where you have now over 200 suspects. Everybody has a theory. Everybody has a suspect. It's an unsolved detective story, I think, for the general public.
I don't think we will ever know who Jack the Ripper was. This is partly because even if we find good evidence of who he was, there will be a segment of the Ripperological community, as it were, that will deny it. And that happens all the time.
More than 100 years later, 10 weeks of savage murder still captivates us. The decades spawning ever more elaborate theories.
Probably the biggest fantasy is the royal conspiracy involving Prince Eddie, who was to become the Duke of Clarence, Queen Victoria's grandson.
There are so many versions of it, involving the Freemasons, involving Queen Victoria's doctor, members of the cabinet, even the Prime Minister. Lewis Carroll, the author of the Alice in Wonderland books, has been named as being the Ripper. There's been other suspicions as well that Joseph Merrick, commonly known as the Elephant Man, was responsible for the murders. No evidence at all. I mean, no even motive. I think Merrick walking around the streets probably would have actually been pretty evident to individuals.
But this shows you how much Jack the Ripper has been sort of lumped in with folklore figures like Dracula and Frankenstein, to the point where you can insert him into any timeline you want.
Yeah.
For dramatic purposes.
Well, with the Ripper, you've got numerous comic books. You've got Gotham by Gaslight, in which the Batman, Bruce Wayne, is accused of being Jack the Ripper. Then there is one with the Duke of Clarence being named as Jack the Ripper. And he battles out with Dracula for the love of Mary Kelly.
There are any number of permutations you can do on Jack the Ripper, because nobody knew who he was, and that's the romance which has been packaged round a series of extremely brutal murders. There is nothing romantic about the reality, but we love the romance, and we leave behind the brutality of what actually happened.
I feel like it's important to take away from the trivialized nature of some of the movies and stories that are out there. And it almost idolizes the offender rather than the victims. It might just be an entertainment type of thing and not even thinking that these are real people and they have family and I'm one.
The hunt for Jack the Ripper is a quest, and it's a journey, and even if we never reach the end of the journey, it's been one hell of a good ride, isn't it? I mean, look at the sort of things that we've learned just by looking at it.
It's a quote which has come back to me again and again and again, which goes long back, that I thought on the day of judgment, when all things are known, when Jack the Ripper steps forward and calls out his name, we shall all look at one another and say, who? I don't think that the story can ever be completely closed. We've now got the legend. The legend has taken over.